my children are and it's something that I constantly reflect on. And one thing I've learned about myself is anytime I've had a big decision to make, like, do I even want to start a PhD? Because that is a huge life-changing decision. I always bring it back to, is this going to make me a better father, or am I going to stay the same, or whatever else? And anytime I've used that approach, has always worked out for me. So I'm really grateful for that. I am Nehiyaw, and I was just talking to some of the leadership here. We actually don't use the word Cree to Cree. So we do use the word Cree. Cree is a lot more simple and it's more slang. So the word Cree is actually a French word. And it's actually, I believe it derives from the word cristano, which means somebody who yells. And so the French traders way back in the 1700s, they seen Cree people in the St. Lawrence, what is now Quebec. And that's what they identified them as. So I am Nehiyaw. And Nehiyaw, if you were to unpack it a little bit, just means people of the four: spirit, emotion, physical, and mental, but also people of the four directions. So we really, the number 4 is very sacred to us. It's something that I've tried to implement into my research as well. So I'm a researcher, PhD student. My supervisors are Dr. Lonnie Zwegenbaum and Dr. Dave Nicholas. They are absolutely amazing. I couldn't do what I do without them. While they don't have a lot of experience working with Indigenous or First Nations communities, they really give me the freedom that I need to be able to do the work, but they also give me a lot of great guidance and some of that tough criticism when I need to hear as well. And they allow me to really navigate these two very different worlds at times. And then, so our last thing is, I always tell people that autism is an adventure. It's something that, sometimes things are going really great and you can celebrate, but sometimes things aren't so great. And sometimes you need to be able to adapt, right? So I've always just tried to approach it like, I don't know what today's going to bring me, but I'm going to approach it like I'm on an adventure, and every day is going to be different. And I love that. So we had a land acknowledgement. Be really mindful of these land acknowledgements. I find a lot of them can be performative. And what I mean by that is you say it, but you're not really backing it up with a lot of action. So I think truth and reconciliation needs a lot of action behind it. And before you get to the reconciliation part, we still have a lot of work to do on the truth part. And so this is the truth here that I like to acknowledge, is that I acknowledge and honor my ancestors, some of which did attend residential schools and some didn't make it home. These were children. These children were severely abused at times. So my community of Musquechees, they actually had one of the largest residential schools in all of Canada. I think there was 600 to 700 children per year, which is a lot. And despite all that, there's still a lot of great things happening in our community. One thing I try and tell people is if you do want to work in our community, you have to become really almost intimately familiar with trauma, unfortunately. And because trauma manifests itself in a lot of different ways. It could be addiction, it could be other types of dysfunction. It could be something as simple as being late to meetings all the time. It could be a form of trauma. The inability to look you in the eye, or self-esteem issues, that at the individual level, but there's a lot of community trauma too. And so while this work that I'm doing is really, it's not an easy work. I'll never say it's easy. It's definitely worthwhile for me because I get to try and make a better life, not only for my children, but for all the children in my communities and in communities across Canada too. So just a few notes on terminology. So the term Indigenous really is a catch-all term. I equate it to like European or Asian. You don't go to Europe and people aren't identifying as European. That's not what happens. You're German, you could be from a certain community, a certain language within that region. I don't identify as Indigenous. It's not something I do. I think if somebody identifies as Indigenous in front of you, that's kind of a red flag that maybe they don't have that close of a connection to community that we would need them to do this kind of work. I'm not saying that people who have Indigenous identity or Indigenous ancestry aren't or don't have claim to that. I think there's a lot of work that has to happen before you're able to claim something like that. I've put a lot of work into learning the language and to go into culture. I did not grow up with any of the culture. My mom had the language stripped from her. We never were taught it. I didn't grow up with ceremony or cultural events. It's something I've had to put a lot of time and effort in, but it's paying off for my children. And so be really mindful when people start to, define themselves as certain things. So the terms, Aboriginal, Native, Indian, these are used. Indian's more of a legal term. Don't ever use it in, day to day. Aboriginals dated as well. If people start calling me Indian or Aboriginal, I assume that they're being rude. Native is super informal. I use it. And sometimes I just use it in day-to-day language though. So if you're trying to identify somebody, I always say get as specific as you can, right? So what tribe are you from? What community are you from? Who's your family? And those types of things that allows that person to situate themselves in a really healthy and good way. So I identify as, again, Nehiyaw or Plains Cree. And yeah, the more specific you get, the better. So just a note on autism terminology. I personally, and this is my own personal thing, I have no skin in the game. This is just something as a parent, I use autistic rather than instead of someone with autism, because to me, somebody with autism is like there's a normal person hiding behind that autism that's trying to come out. And that's just not the case for my children. I accept them for exactly who they are. My goal isn't to change them. My goal is to just make their lives a little bit better so that we can communicate and connect in, really good ways. I don't use autism spectrum disorder. I just use autism, is that word, disorder. It's really a deficit. It's something that really, invokes a certain feeling almost, right? That this is such a negative thing. And I try and use the neurodiversity lens, and I spelled that wrong, as much as I can. And I'll touch on neurodiversity at the very end of this, really looking at it from a decolonizing lens too. So a little bit about me. But before I get into this, I'll tell you why I tell so much about myself. In our communities, it's not who you are, but whose you are. And so when I go to a community, the first thing I get asked is like, who are your parents? Who are their parents? Who are their parents? And then so you have to actually relationally situate yourself. And what this does is it allows for better relationship building. It allows to build that connection right away, and then you have that in almost, right? And I think that's a lot of challenge that a lot of outsiders have is they come to our communities and it's just a different way of thinking. We have a different worldview. And a lot of people aren't really willing to situate themselves. And the example I'll use is my wife. So my wife is of European descent. She's German Irish. And she doesn't really practice those cultures. She feels very disconnected from them. And to me, I've always encouraged her to go at least visit them, right? Like you have an opportunity to re-immerse yourself in like your culture, and you should be able to do that. Like your culture shouldn't end at being just Canadian, because Canada in and of itself is only a few hundred years old. You have deeper roots than that. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with going back to your roots. Nobody's telling you you have to be something you're not or anything like that. So for me, I've got connections to Chief Popish Chase. If anybody's familiar with Edmonton, much of South Edmonton right now is the Popish Chase Reserve. It was illegally surrendered in the early 1900s. The community was starved out by then Indian agent Frank Oliver. If you're familiar with them, again, there's Oliver neighborhood, which is named after him. And so he wanted that land for himself, and his family and the families that he was close to became they're wealthy beyond imagination now because of that. Because that land now is worth billions and billions. And so so that's from my dad's side. And then from my mom's side, I'm actually have lineage to Chief Big Bear. So Chief Big Bear, of course, was one of the original signatories to Treaty 6. He was a very well-respected chief among the Crees. And he was really known for how generous he was. He wasn't like a warrior, I'm going to go, be violent towards other tribes type of chief. Great negotiator, super generous, was always willing to build and create relationships between people. And so I've only learned these things as an adult though, because a lot of this information was even taken away from me. And so as I'm learning, the more deeper my roots get, the better my well-being is getting. And so I encourage anybody, it doesn't matter where you're from, what part of the globe, highly encourage you to just go reconnect with that. I'm a first generation residential school survivor. So my mom went to the Hobima residential school, both of my grandmothers. Their experiences obviously had a huge impact on me. So I never got to meet either of my grandmothers. My mom's mom was actually murdered in the 1700s, and they never found the perpetrator. And then my dad's mom was murdered too. And so they both were taken in their early 30s. And so I'd had it, and then so my grandfather on my mom's side, he walked out on his family. And that's why my mom had to go to residential school. And so he walked out. My dad's dad, I met him, but he, because of all of his trauma, he was severely an alcoholic. And so I never really got to build a relationship with either. So I have an entire generation that usually provides some support with most people, right? Most people get to meet their grandparents. Most of them are probably somewhat functional. I didn't have that at all. I had my mom. My mom is the most amazing person I've ever met. She took all of that trauma and all that, that negative energy, and she was able to really craft out a fairly peaceful life for herself. So she was an early education, like a pre-K teacher for 46 years. She loves children. And so she never missed a day of work that I know of. She's extremely hardworking. She really, despite all of her experiences, wanted to create a better life for her children. And so she really wanted to she allowed me to, feel compassion, which she didn't get. She didn't get parented. You got to understand, at these schools, there was no parenting, no love. These children were institutionalized. These were basically, they had the same concept as a jail. And she didn't get any of those other things. She got some structure, but that structure even of itself is really triggering for her, right? Like, she cannot eat porridge because she would eat porridge every single morning. And she would have to cook and clean and do all these other things. And she wasn't getting a schooling. Like, I think calling them a residential school is not the appropriate term. These were residential institutions. And that's what I call them. So as mentioned earlier, I'm a registered member of Samson Cree Nation, one of the 4 reserves that makes the Muskogee. Muskogee is actually made up of 4 different bands: Samson, Ermineskin, Louisville, and Montana. Large community, about 18,000 on reserve residents. I would say about 26,000 total, but because of the lack of housing and other different things happening in the community, there's a lot of immigration to and from. But I didn't grow up in Muskogee. I grew up in Enoch with my mom. So my mom is a registered member of Enoch, and she really and so I think that really broadens my kind of scope and how I operate, right? So I grew up on an urban reserve, not very much culture, but I was able to get, a very Western education, which I think is helping me today as a university student. And I think the reason they wanted to do that was that, so Muskogee they had a huge amount of oil royalties in the 1980s, and my parents wanted me to access that. So he's from Samson. My dad was an RCMP for 26 years. And despite all his trauma, he was able to craft out of so my parents somehow met each other. I wouldn't say they dealt with the things they should have, but they didn't pass a lot of them on. So I'm really grateful for my parents. I'm grateful for all my ancestors, right? Because I often tell people that my healing isn't just my healing. I'm healing for my parents, and my grandparents, and so on and so forth. And everything that they've done to get me to where I am, I'm super grateful for. So a little bit about me. Again, I have 4 children. So here on the left, we've got Oliver, and then here in the Levi sweater, we have Marshall. So they're twins. Marshall is on the autism spectrum. I would say his autism, if I was to describe it, is more like a personality trait. And what I mean by that is, if you didn't have a lot of experience with autism, you probably wouldn't suspect it. He hit like all of his developmental milestones. Super smart kid. He does get overwhelmed in social situations. And then the sensory thing, like, he cannot go into a hot tub for the life of him. He's like, "It's cooking me," and which is absolutely he's like, "I can't do it." And that's probably the extent, right? I'm sure he's masking. I'm sure he's doing all those things that most children do, but and the other thing, I guess, is, and then this is one of those stereotypes, right? Is he's super literal. And so if you're joking around with him, sometimes he doesn't understand. So he'll look at you and be like, "Huh? That's a little too nuanced for me," but and then so we have Oliver here in the University of Alberta sweater. Oliver's not autistic. He's about as good of a brother that you're gonna get, though. Super thoughtful, He's always wanting to do, things with his family, with his brothers, with myself. And I'm super grateful for him because while I'm really mindful of not like parentifying him, he does enjoy caregiving. I know that. I can see that in him already. And then here we have Anders. So Anders in the blue jacket. So Anders, his autism's, I guess, a bit more pronounced. You're gonna notice it right away. Especially when you start to talk to him. Like he's made a lot of progress verbally in the last couple of years, which I'm super grateful for. And he's a lot more social now too, right? So he's making friends at the school park. He's, trying to talk to adults and stuff like that. And he's just, and all of our therapists have told us this. We've worked with about 5 or 6 now. They're like, is he always smiling? Is that his thing? I'm like, yeah, that's just who Anders is. He's like a smiley, just a great energy. He loves just like, being around, his family. He's our, like, honestly, like I couldn't ask for a better child. Like I'll never complain about them. And then we have Evelyn. So Evelyn and my wife Margot here, that's our kid. So the 3 are from a previous relationship. And then Evelyn is the kind of the star of the show. Her Cree name is Atracosawasis, which translates as star child. She's 2 years old now, super energized, already talking and things. And, is somebody, I think that she's really the glue that keeps it all together because she knows how to get her way, but she also knows how to, make us laugh and stuff like that as a family. So I'm really, so my family just really keeps me grounded, essentially. And I love the fact that I'm able to, be the parent that I am to them. So this shouldn't come as a surprise. I'm a 1st generation university grad. That includes my bachelor's, master's, and going to be PhD. I won't be the last though. I know that I have family members who have already seen what I'm doing and been like, okay, I can do it too, because representation matters. And that's one thing that I think we really need to start thinking about is how do we start building that capacity, not just at like when they're done high school, but even earlier. And I'm wanting to bring in, some Indigenous occupational therapists or speech language or whatever else, psychologists, and bring them to the community to show our students that you can become these things, right? I didn't have that representation. I would argue I still don't have it now. I just have to be that representative. So I'm trying to do what's best for my family and myself, but I know that other people are looking at me and saying, if he can do it, so can I. And I love that. I've been conducting research in Musqueam for about 7 years. It started in my undergrad and then led me to my master's and then obviously the PhD. All of it has been, and it's slowly evolved too. So it started very like community based. And what I mean by that is we had like people not from the community coming in and doing research, building relationships and things. And then me coming in, and I was a part of the quote unquote capacity building. And then I just took off with it, which has led to my PhD. So my PhD is going to be some of the first actually like First Nations community led research to happen actually. So fully, while I have supports that are not from the community, all of my decisions get made through the community. And that doesn't happen very often. And I think that when it's all said and done, the results of what I'm doing are going to be very reflective of the community. They're not going to be my interpretation. I'm going to have a say in it, obviously, as a community member, but I'm going to always bring everything I learn, all my questions and everything else back to the community before I move forward with it. I also chair the Indigenous Relations Circle for the Autism Society of Alberta, and I'll touch more on that later, but we're just a group of people who all have a passion for autism. We meet monthly, we learn from each other, and we have some really exciting things coming up. So I'll touch on those too. The last thing I'll say is I am not an autism expert. I fully believe you need a lived experience of being autistic, and I don't have that. I can come from the perspective of a caregiver. I can learn from my children and other autistic people and kind of share those learnings, but I'll never be the expert. And my goal is to be able to provide space for the actual experts. The first thing I want to really touch on for this is something I call the Indigenous deficit discourse. And so I'm going to read this quote, and this is something that happens way too often. It happens in academia and media and everything else, but so deficit-based research can contribute to stigmatization when problematic health issues are repeatedly characterized in the context of a specific population. Additionally, when any given health deficit is repetitively associated with Indigenous people, through the research, there's a risk of stereotyping. Unfortunately, due to the lack of critical exposure in education media, deficit-based research given without proper framing can perpetuate negative characterizations of Indigenous people. And despite all of our best efforts, including even myself, I am guilty of this. I would argue 100% of Canadians are. And I say that with, not trying to make people feel guilty or anything, because I fully believe that the way in which Indigenous peoples are framed in the media and education and health is actively trying to make us seem like something that we're not. And the example I'll use is, when did you learn about residential schools? And why do you think you learned so late? It's like the government was trying to hide something, right? And they were being conscious about it. I'm not big into grand conspiracies or anything like that, but when you don't put that type of stuff in your education curriculum, that's a conscious effort to leave out misinformation. And guess what? When you leave out critical information, that's a form of, in my eyes, propaganda. And so we have an entire nation conditioned in a certain way to think about Indigenous peoples in a certain way, which is usually very negative. You can see this in the media. The example I'll use there is that the majority of stories within the media on Indigenous peoples and populations is, you often see us framed as an economic problem. And that happens way too much. And that's dehumanizing. That's taking away who we are. And so when you frame something as like, okay, I'll just use the Indigenous Service of Canada. Their budget is like $9 billion or something. And you'll hear somebody reflect that, be like, oh, we give you $9 billion every year. And then, whoa, we got to stop here. We got to unpack that for a second. Half of that money doesn't make it out of the ministry. It pays people to oppress us. It pays people to do, to keep the Indian Act in place. And people make their entire careers off of this. And so there's a lack of political and personal will to change it, because it threatens people's livelihoods, unfortunately. So what you got to understand is that we are up against billion-dollar systems. Like the child family system is a billion-dollar system that is still taking away our children now. There's more children in care now today than there ever was during residential school. Yeah? And you're paying non-Indigenous families to do what the Indigenous families can do. Right? So like the example I use there is, I have a really good friend who has an autistic adult son, who sometimes can be violent and has to, have special care and things in place to make sure he doesn't get to that state. And he's like, I have to either quit my job or I have to give my child up to the system. But if I give my child up to the system, another family can take him and get paid for that, but I can't. And you can see how problematic that is, because you disconnect that child from his kinship, from his community, from his culture. And so these policies and regulations and legislation that's put in place, we are up against all of it. And despite all of that, I think a lot of our families are still doing great jobs. And so I really want to share these stories within my research. But I'll move on for a second. So we're going to look at this, and then we're going to look at this, and we're just going to change Indigenous with autistic, and we're going to see the exact same thing, right? The medical model, super deficit oriented. I can't even imagine being autistic and going to like an autism conference. Like, we have to fix them. Like, you hear that, we have to cure this. And it's so othering. Like, it just makes my skin crawl. And I'm like, this is how it used to be for Indigenous peoples in the 80s and 90s. Like, you'd go to an Indigenous conference, and there'd be a bunch of people who've never been to the community talking about how we have to fix these problems. And I feel like there's so many learnings that I can share from Indigenous health now that I can bring them to the autism area. And I'm hoping to do that because, there's a saying that we've been using for decades, nothing about us without us. And I see that now popping up more over here in the autism realm. So I'm really grateful that I'm able to try and bring the two together. I'm really hoping that these lessons, we can start to, implement them, because we have a lot to teach too, as, First Nations, Indigenous communities. So just a little bit about my PhD research. Here's just some background. So recently, a systemic review was done with a focus on I use ASD here, but I don't prefer it. In Indigenous communities at the international level, and the findings outlined an urgent need for resources to be dedicated to support research for Indigenous and First Nations people across the lifespan. And I would say it is urgent. I would say that our children and the people in our communities, the families, they're suffering needlessly because they can't get the services. They're suffering because the lack of political will, that they're also suffering because of the lack of awareness. And I'm not just going to put the responsibility just on the federal, provincial governments or anybody else. I'm going to put the responsibility on our communities too, because we're not very good at making sure that we're taking care of our own. Yes, there's a lack of resources and stuff like that and all these other things happening. But I would argue, and I'll touch on this later too, that like the reserves, perspective I'm coming from, are not friendly to disabilities. And I put that on chief and council. And I'm going to continue to put that on them because they're the ones that can make immediate impact and they're not. And so while, yes, we need more support from the province and from the federal government, we can start doing things tomorrow that make things better for our people. So I'm going to be using strength-based decolonizing methods. So the Indigenous deficit discourse, I can't perpetuate that anymore. And so one of my rules is that 80% of my work is going to be strength-based. The other 20% I'll acknowledge, I'll even honor the dysfunction and the deficits, but I'm not going to focus on that because that's been focused on way too much. Decolonizing methods. So I'm currently in the process of creating a Nehiyaw-based research methodology, which is really exciting and new. These again are very community specific though. And so I'm working with elders, language speakers and traditional knowledge keepers in the community to really see what does a Cree research paradigm or Nehiyaw research paradigm really look like in our community. I'm currently finishing up a scoping review, so hopefully I can have something out that really explores all the Indigenous autism research in Canada. There's not very much. I think I've got 21 articles, maybe half of them are peer reviewed, and they all kind of say the same thing. So there's just a lack of research is what they all say. And that's not really a big finding or surprising, but it's good to have that to kind of draw from as I continue my work. So I work, again, this is community-led and in full partnership with the Muskogee's Education School Commission. The interesting about this, I want to just say one thing about MESC. They provide services, SLP, OT, and all that, to children in the school system without a diagnosis. And that to me is really meeting the families where they're at. And that I think has to happen even more. Maybe there's an opportunity to say, yes, we'll start providing these services, but with the goal of getting a diagnosis. Because as soon as that child turns 18, they lose access to everything, right? Like getting a PDD on a reserve right now is next to impossible. Getting anything else, and you can't qualify for Jordan's principle once you turn 18, all these other things, right? So I really love the fact that they're able to do, navigate that in a very unique and creative way, but it comes with other challenges too. So just reflecting and trying to make sure that you're addressing those challenges as well. My research has to be action oriented. I have to give something back. I find a lot of people come into our communities, they do research, and then that's the end of it. And the example I like using is a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Richard Oster. And so he came to the community. He spent 2 years in the community before he did any research. And that's a long time as an academic. That could be like career suicide. But he knew that the relationship part was the most important. And so even though like he did his PhD, he's been doing other studies, he's still in the community quite a bit. He's coming to powwows. He was just at the powwow this past summer. And so he's really invested. And that's what we need. We need people who are invested and giving back. So I'm currently producing a film, actually, looking at the experiences of autism and looking at how do we start connecting our children more with the culture, right? With the ceremonies and with language. There's a parent support group that was just developed, so parents learning from each other. And then the other thing is we're going to be having some sensory friendly cultural events, round dance. Eventually we want to do a powwow to really allow these children to come and experience the culture and connect with the culture because they're missing out. And that to me is not good. So early findings, again, these are the negatives. So these are all through different community engagements I've had, not only within Muskogees, but across Alberta and across Canada. So there are huge obstacles to getting a diagnosis, right? these obstacles can be actually cultural. So I've learned that some of the parents would talk about, why would I need a diagnosis? That's my child. Like, how does that change anything? But then there's also the structural challenges, right? So fear of the public health system. If I were to go talk to people in the community, every one of them has had a bad experience with the health system in one way or another, including myself. We've had bad experiences with the justice system. These systems, again, they're built not for us. So there's also just lack of awareness of what even autism is in the community. And so I'm trying to develop like a campaign, like an awareness campaign, that we can start looking at what does autism look like, and how do we get early education people like daycares involved, because that's kind of the front line, right? And they would be able to see it before anybody else, because they spend so much time with these children. And unfortunately, I don't know if they even know how to have conversations with the parents in discussing that, because it's such like a heavy charged subject, right? This is another big problem we have. Families have to leave the reserve for better access to services. So if you want to get, let's say, an FSCD contract or PDD, you have to leave the reserve. You have to have an off reserve address. And then after that, and so what happens in our communities is you end up leaving all of your kinship supports and you leave your cultural supports, but then you get these other types, and you have to make a decision as a parent what supports are going to be best long-term. And ideally you want them together. Like, that's the best thing for the child, right? And even we've had to go through this process ourselves. So my boy's mom, she still lives out of Musqueam, and she had to make a really hard decision of allowing Anders to come live with me. Now, I would prefer him to stay with his mom. I grew up with my mom. It's just better for the child. I believe that. I'm not saying that I'm a bad parent or anything, but I just really fully believe that he needs his mom at his age. And so we had to come. So he ended up moving with me here in Edmonton so we can access all of that and get him into a school. We got him into the interactions program through Edmonton Public, which has been amazing. But none of that exists on reserve, right? And so we felt that he would get kind of lost in the shuffle and fall through the cracks a bit if we were to keep him there. But I've been really mindful of bringing the culture and the language into our home. And I have the resources and capability to do that. A lot of parents don't. Another good thing that happens is bad politics get in the way. I think politics in general gets in the way of all of us, right? All of our work. And so it's not that different for our communities. Again, there was a lot of missed opportunities for interventions. So my son, Anders, did go to on-reserve daycare. I would have appreciated that they brought it up earlier, because I waited till he was 3 before I started the diagnosis process. He probably should have started earlier. I'm the one who went out and signed him up and had to do all these extra things. And if the daycare would have even mentioned it to me, I think I would have done that a lot earlier. There's a lot of apprehension when working with the provincial government. So our communities, First Nations communities, our relationship is with the Crown, and the province, it's not with the province, right? And so we have a treaty relationship with the Crown. And so we're doing our best to try and get that treaty relationship honored. Unfortunately, one of the outcomes of that is that the province, of course, is in charge of all the services. And so now we don't want to abrogate treaty, because that's our original relationship, and we feel that that has to be honored in some way. But the province won't come in and provide these services now, because we're trying to work with the federal government. So the federal government ends up fighting over who does what, who pays for what, and nothing ever happens out of it, unfortunately. And that's the story of Jordan River Anderson, right? Like, just fighting amongst themselves who pays for what when children are suffering. And that's what I see. I see the children, not the finances or the budget, right? Of course, funding doesn't always equate success. There's an urgent need for evidence, and that's, I think, where my research comes in. We don't know prevalence. We don't know what the family's experiences are. We don't know exactly what's happening in the community. And I know the government wants those numbers, right? That's government language. It's like, okay, we have these numbers, so we can apply this amount of funding to this, and so on and so forth. That's kind of the formula. I mentioned this earlier, but reserves are really not that friendly to any disability, whether it's neurodevelopmental or mobility or whatever else. There's just lack of awareness, lack of will to make it better. But I won't get stuck there. Here are the positives. Again, these are through community engagements. We're really good at accepting our children, which I'm really grateful for. I find there's almost like a difference. So I find in like the Western world, there's like, okay, I'm going to get this child therapy until I can accept him. Whereas our families were like, okay, we're going to the therapies. And so I'm really mindful, and I think that that's what the parents really do. I went to the parent support groups, and both parents showed up. Like there was 3 families, and both families had both parents, mom and dad, and a grandparent with them. And that to me shows, and the one thing they all mention is how much that child is loved by each and every one of the family members, despite all the challenges and things that come with them. And they're very like upfront about that. Like, we love this child, and this child is a gift to us. And then they talk about, but we can't access the services we need. Autism can be viewed as a gift. And I'll touch on this later too. There are different words for autism in our communities, right? Some view it as a spiritual gift. Some view it as, that ability to see the world in a very different lens should be celebrated and almost harnessed a bit to allow them to, explore the world for us. There are a lot of inspiring and allyship stories. So we have a community pediatrician who does incredible work. She's probably overwhelmed, but she's there because she wants to be there. And I talked about the jurisdictional issues earlier. Funding for physicians on reserves is abysmal. Like, she could probably make way more money somewhere else, but she's not doing it for that. She's doing it because she genuinely wants to. There's a lot of families that are really trying, but they get overwhelmed, poverty, don't have a ride, don't have all these different access to resources, but they're still trying to show up to these parent groups and things and trying to learn, even though they're being pulled in a million different directions. Some of them don't even know if they're going to get groceries that week, and they're still trying to provide the best for their children. I talked about kinship supports, right? So for me, Gookum, like my mom, their grandmother, huge support. We just dropped them off there, and then they don't want to come home most days. And so she's really like, and Musham as well, his grandfather. And so we have all these different supports we can draw from because we're very close knit with the families. Cultural continuities. Now, studies have showed this, that the more cultural continuity you have, the better the well-being of the community. And so that's the one thing I would argue, like Musqueam is really rich with, is culture, language, and traditional knowledge and stuff like that. Whereas if I were to go to Enoch, they wouldn't have as much. It's there, but it's not as satiating, so to speak. Jordan's principle, again, is a huge positive. I'm really grateful for the work of Cindy Blackstock and the rest of her team. The challenge here is that it's becoming less and less accessible. And a lot of our families, they believe that if you get told no once, then that's it. And I keep reminding them that Jordan's principle is a legal requirement. It's not, the government's not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because it is a legal requirement that they have to provide services for our children. And so even if they say no to you, you keep appealing. You appeal that and you keep fighting. So it is extra work, but eventually, I think if you're able to craft a good enough argument or a good enough, rationale for what you need, then they're going to say yes. Again, I think I touched on this earlier, opportunities for shared learning between Indigenous health and autism researchers. So I'm trying to bring the two together and doing as much as I can, because I feel like there's shared learning opportunities between the two. But now I'm going to just touch on decolonizing autism. So if you've ever been to any of my other presentations, there's a word I use quite a bit, pitatum. It's he or she thinks differently. And that's how we define autism, which is different than the medical model, right? So if you go look at DSM-5, it's deficit, negative, lack of, whereas we're like, okay, that person just thinks differently than me. And then on top of that, our worldview doesn't see difference as bad. I find when something's different, it's like, okay, that must be bad or something. Difference is more neutral. And so when you take a neutral approach, you can encourage more acceptance. I touched on, like, it can be viewed as gifted. The other thing, and I talked about this, is neurodiversity isn't new. It didn't start in the 90s like most people want you to think. Our communities, the Cree community, the Nehiyaw community, have been practicing neurodiversity for centuries. Ceremony. So this ceremony, if you don't know, so the pictured here on the right would be considered like a artist rendition of a ceremony. So what they're doing here is they're drumming, dancing, singing. I actually brought my sons to what's known as a chicken dance ceremony. So it's in this big lodge. Everybody sits down, you have a feast in the middle, and then you dance and you drum and you sing. And I brought my sons there, and I just remember just how like their energy was just different. They're just like I felt like they were just like more connected, is how I would describe it. And they still talk about it to this day. Like, do you remember? I asked them, like, do you remember going to the chicken dance? And we're like, yeah. Like, I remember eating the food and dancing and drumming and stuff like that. And so I'm trying to bring that to all the other families, because not all of our families have access to it. There are different things happening in the community. Some families grew up with a lot of tradition and some grew up with none still. But I find for myself anyways, the more connected I am to that, the better I am and the better I can be for my family. The other thing I say about ceremonies, they're very inclusive. I know there's this fear around, okay, I wasn't invited. What I learned is that as soon as you hear about that ceremony, that's your invitation. You don't need some formal email or text or phone call. As soon as you hear about it, you're good to go. What I would love to see is like on the land services and assessments, right? On the land therapies. And I know that there's like different version of this already kind of being built out, but for ours, it would be including the language or including different, cultural activities. I talked about sensory friendly cultural events. Last thing I'll say about ceremony is that at the very heart of decolonization is healing. And that's something that I think everybody could use. We might act like, there's this thing in Western academia where you're not supposed to be personal. Doesn't make sense to me. And every time I have a meeting with my PhD supervisors, I'm like, we got to do mental health check-in. That's the first thing we do. And at first they were super awkward about it, but now they're getting used to it. It's like they get to talk about things that are affecting them day to day. And I feel like you go to this meeting sometimes, it's straight to business and then you're done. And there's no real connection being built. And so I'm always trying to look for opportunities to build that connection. So a couple of years ago, there was a research project. I don't think there's any actual evidence or articles that came out of it, but it was with the Cowessess First Nation. So the Cowessess First Nation, I believe, is near Regina, if I'm not mistaken. It might be Saskatoon. But they went and did what I'm doing, and they came out with a community report. So here you can see the different words we have that are specific to autism. So before I used the word pitatum, that to me is more of a catch-all term. So that would include like ADHD or FASD or things like that, the neurodevelopmental kind of terminology. These ones are specific to autism. So I know Jackie was kind of struggling with the Cree words earlier. I'm going to struggle with these ones. So I'm going to show you that I wasn't born this way. This is something that I'm working on too. So the first one is ka kamawachi and iwinasit. So that translates as given a unique or quiet spiritual intelligence. And the next one is pitos manatunik iwinasit, given different way of thinking on its own spiritual intelligence. And then A mikosit pitos manatun ichikan, given a different way of spiritual thinking. And A mikosit pitos a siwaka isi waskawat, given the gift of moving a different way or being. The main common one is the word pitos, which is pitatum. It's the same thing. This is just a lot more specific. And so what I was taught actually in the community, I was speaking with an elder on this, he was telling me that autistic children, a part of them actually stays connected to the spiritual space. And so when they come here, so we believe that the children's spirit picks the parent, and that it's up to the parent to guide and provide and do all these things for the child, but that child actually chooses their parents. And so a piece of them actually stays over there. And so they are more connected to that than any of us. And to me, that's such like a powerful way of looking at it, right? Like saying, guess what? You've got this gift. Let's explore it a bit. There's this, and this directly challenges the medical model, and that idea that we have to diagnose. And as soon as I hear that word diagnose, I think disease or illness. And that's not what we think. We think of somebody that's just different. And so I think as I kind of move forward in my work, I think these are going to be I'm going to build off of this. And I really hope that I'm able to engage more with the broader autistic community and then start getting their thoughts on this and how they feel about it. Because the ones that I have talked to are saying your definition fits in with how I feel and this medical model. So final, I know this question will probably be asked, how to support First Nations families and communities? It's all about relationships. So the word we would use is huitotuin, and that translates, it's actually a legal tradition we would have used traditionally in our tribes. And it's really about relationships. Now, when I think about relationships, my mind automatically goes to the social ones, right? Like your relationships to your colleagues or your friends or your family. And those are the human relationships, but there's also relationships to yourself. What's your relationship like with yourself? What's your relationship like with your community? What's your relationship like with something like food? And so this is like an all-encompassing term that really wants to bring that spirituality into those relationships. Like, what's your relationship to the environment? And because they're all relationships in some way or another. And you would even, it's like, do you have a relationship to the mountains, right? Like, I'm sure we all go to the mountains and we feel great about it. That right then and there is connection. That connection's a relationship. And so it's just thinking about things in a different way that really honors those relationships. And so when you're thinking about wanting to work with our families, think about not only am I just here as this person, but how am I building this relationship in a way that is meeting the family where they're at, but allowing the family to be themselves too. I know I talked about this earlier, but become trauma informed. There's trauma informed training and things like that. 100% of the people in my community are traumatized in some way. Get familiar with the TRC, calls to action. There's 94 of them. Learn how to lean into discomfort. And this is another big one. I feel like when we start to work with cultures that are different than our own, we get uncomfortable. And through that discomfort, we kind of can disengage. And so you back out. And for me, I've had to learn how to, lean into a bit and then self-reflect and say, why is this making me uncomfortable? Is it something that's going on up here? Or is it something that's external? Is it something I can work on? Because you understand, like, when you're in a state of discomfort, it's going to affect the way that you provide care or you provide services. Start to look upstream for solutions, right? So yes, we need services in our communities, but we also need clean drinking water. So we got to start thinking about all the other things that are affecting this family's inability or ability to get those services. Meet the families where they're at. Try and walk a mile in our moccasins, right? So see where they're coming from, get to know them. We all have our own stories. Most of us want to share them. And I talked about this earlier, be aware of performative reconciliation. Always have actions to all the things you're saying. So last thing, Indigenous Relations Circle. This circle, so the Autism, I'll read here, the Autism Society of Alberta would like to introduce the Indigenous Relations Circle. Rooted in respect, the circle's goals are to bring together diverse perspectives on the experiences of Indigenous peoples and autism in Alberta. The circle is a central concept to Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and the Indigenous Relations Circle will listen, learn, share, connect, and advocate for Indigenous autistic peoples and families. So again, I chair that circle. It's by far my favorite meeting out of any, because I get to go and talk to people who are like-minded, have my experience. And I just feel like there's a weight that gets taken off my shoulders every time, and I'm able to do the work that I need to do. It's made up of, like, if you go to look on the website, there's profiles of everybody who's on it. And I'm really grateful to even be a part of that. But the reason I bring it up is that we're for the first year of the circle, we're very much in like, okay, we're going to learn as much from each other as we can. We're going to start relationship building, but now we're in how do we start to leverage these relationships and learnings? And so of course I want to have more conversations on how do we get these services and things like that in our communities, because right now we have, and I would argue that this circle and Alberta is leading Canada right now because of it in this area. And I'm a part of like the national autism strategy, those conversations, and nobody's doing what we're doing. And so I think there's a great opportunity right now to really have an impact for our children and for anybody who's autistic. So hi, thank you. Again, these are my boys, and I would now love to have some questions.
Hey, Deb, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's all right. I was just saying, I'm sure everybody's just too shy to ask questions.
So what I usually do, I give people a few minutes and then I start calling on people because everybody has a question. I know you do.
I know I have a question about some of the individuals that we're working with that are adults today. And so they access some of our Quest programs and our arts programs and a variety of programs. And I know that they have a yearning to learn this, but they've been very urbanized and not brought up often with their culture. How is an organization? I know you gave some suggestions, but like to get sort of real for us, how would we even approach that, or what could we do in the environment that could even invite those kind of conversations or learnings to occur?
Work really well in the past is obviously hiring somebody with that cultural knowledge, right? So I know different organizations do that. You got to be really mindful of where you're working though. So let's say you're doing something in Edmonton, that person's got to be Cree, right? Because majority of us are Cree here. There are some Sioux, Stoney, Blackfoot that do reside here, but the majority of people are going to access your services are going to be of that. Or you build some sort of like network that works, regionally, so by treaty. And just being really mindful of not to overburden this person too, though. They're not going to know everything, and this happens. I've seen this. All of a sudden, you hire a traditional knowledge keeper or your elder, and all of a sudden they're the be all and end all, and you just send people towards them. There's got to be some sort of system that allows them to not only work with the families, but start, working with the employees as well, like getting them, up to speed and whatnot.
Okay. Good advice. I think, Jackie, your ears must have been ringing, because Jackie is our neurodivergent representative and leads the strategy for neurodiversity. And she has said many of the same things. I'm only one person. I only know my experience and my son's experience. And so,
you've an autistic person, you've just met one autistic person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'll speak up because I have trouble staying quiet. Thank you so much, Grant, for the presentation. It's really very, very insightful. My role has been, I've been the Director of Clinical Services here at the Center for 10 years. And it's always struck me that we've had very few First Nations, Indigenous families as part of our community in terms of receiving services. And I've always wondered about that, and your explanation of the fact that families have to give up their status or on reserve address in order to access those services explains that to some extent. I mean, I'm often in meetings with representatives, directors, and managers with family support for children with disabilities and other government agencies. Is there any sort of messaging that we could help provide or amplify or emphasize that would help break down some of these access barriers? Is there anything that we could help educate on in some way?
Yeah, for sure. So you don't really lose. Okay, I'll just address the status thing. Having status doesn't mean you're Indigenous. If you didn't know.
Okay.
Auntie, who's full Sicilian Italian on both sides, who married before 1985, and she has status. She doesn't consider herself Indigenous though. So, so just to your point of the messaging part is that we want to work with the province. I would say most of us. I fully believe that when it comes to children, you need to get as much support as you can. And when people try and argue with me about that, okay, we don't want to work with the province because of our treaty relationship, I say, okay, but right now you're not arguing against me, you're arguing against the children. And that's usually when they kind of clue in that I'm not doing this to hurt people, I'm doing it to get the supports in place. But we do have great examples of this working. So I talked about the Musquecheese Education School Commission. So education is a provincial matter, right? And so they were able to creatively navigate that relationship, but in a way that still allows them to work with the province. And so now what you see in the community happening is teachers are finally being paid on par of what they should be off reserve. They're able to pool resources with each other and with other schools in the district. And they're able to provide services like the ones I was talking about for children. Whereas before they couldn't. And this only happened in the last 3 years. And so my message would always be that we need to start building those relationships. And then from those relationships, you start getting the things in place for the kids and the adults. So being a child on reserve, you're going to have more access to services. But as soon as you turn 18, you're done. Like, you are completely on your own as a family. There's nothing for you. And I mean nothing. I'm not just exaggerating that. Like, you and your family just have to figure it out. And so when you start to build those relationships, you can start thinking about solutions and you can start getting those supports in place. But at the heart of all of it, again, is the relationships. The problem is the province doesn't want to commit to those relationships. They want piecemeal things, right? They want to, I'm going to put a program in here for a few years. And that approach isn't working.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm. I think, Grant, to just sort of pipe in to even make it even more complicated for the landscape that we're working here with our services and most of our community services, is that not only do they not provide services on reserves, if you're in the city and you are actually accessing child welfare services. So a child is in kinship care, or he's in a group home or a foster placement. If that child has autism, there's this idea and this process that they have that they say you can't double dip. So the way the province divides services is disability services under, one ministry, and children's services is under another. And they don't allow those so we've got community children coming into our programs and with staff that don't understand autism. And really, what's your recommendations for how to open dialogue? I mean, I have questioned it for our children that require specialized services. A few have advocated and actually been able to be successful and get it. But that's really rare for them to be successful in getting that. How can we message and help support some of those families to break that extra barrier?
Yeah, I think a lot of our families just need that extra support when they're going through the process. So getting like an FSCD contract for us was like, you needed like this amount of attrition most families just don't have. It took us 9 months.
Yeah.
It's a long time. And when you're considering the development of a child and they're like how they're, operating and things, that could be the difference between them living independently and not. And I find you just have to just keep at it, right? Like and it gets monotonous. But then also bringing so right now, I'm sure there's conversations between like yourself and the government and things. But a lot of these government people, they're not talking with their families. They're talking with, individuals like you. And when they get to talk to families, that's when you can see light bulbs going off that this is real. Like, it's not just, it's not some degrees this way. It's separated from me, but it's like you're interacting with what's happening there now. And that's what I'm trying to do with the research is I'm bringing in those family perspectives first. I'm not going to do prevalence. I'm not going to do anything like that. I'm going to try and capture these stories in the community to allow people to learn from these families, because these families, that's where the expertise is. And right now the expertise is in getting from them to these decision makers.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess one more thought though is for the best service providers I've ever worked with, and I probably shouldn't say this, are the ones who are willing to bend the rules, not break them, but bend them for the families. And
they find creative ways to get around things.
Yes,
You have
Those
to be
are fun.
innovative.
You have to be
Yeah.
super innovative, and
Yeah.
it's okay to like, you maybe get just a hand slap. I get my hand slapped all the time. It's just one of those things that the checks and balances part might not fit with what the family needs, right?
Thank you for that.
Grant, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Just-
From Cree to Nehiyaw, I think whatever, I would take that question and bring it to the circle and ask them. I don't want to be the person who's like, I'm not the identity police or the language police. I'm not here to tell people what and what they shouldn't do. If they're comfortable with using Cree or Nehiyaw, I would ask them. Do you think the National Autism Strategy may address some of those concerns? I don't think the actual autism strategy will. I think it will explore those concerns. Interestingly enough, I don't know if anybody knows who Mike Lake is. So Mike Lake is a member of Parliament, autistic son. He's actually becoming a good friend of mine. I just reached out to him as a father last year. He just introduced the bill, right? Like the bill S203.
Yeah.
Actually puts it into putting the gears into place to get that autism strategy going. And then I was a part of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. So they did their big national report, which was released way back in May, which of course is with Lonnie, who was, I believe, a chair. And I won't talk badly about like the process, other than the fact that I felt like they kind of forgot that there was an Indigenous population. And so what happened is they had this year to do this big assessment, which is hugely problematic because you can't even build relationships in a year. And they're just kind of forced it through. So when you read that national assessment, take that with a grain of salt. What they learned has some applicability, but I wouldn't go so far as to say I would use it in my work. Because I was a part of the process. They brought me on late, even like a year, like 6 months in. And I quickly learned that you're doing this the wrong way. That's what I told them. You have this top-down approach, and this top-down approach isn't going to work because you are, first of all, they were trying to pan-indigenize all of us. So putting First Nations, Métis, Inuit all into the same group, and expecting us to all kind of have the same needs and wants. And on top of that, they weren't even looking at different geographies, right? Like we have rural, remote, urban, right? You have status, non-status. You know, it gets very complex very quickly, and each of these groups is going to have a different wants and needs, especially when it comes to autistic people. So I don't know. That's a lot. From previous work, it's unlikely. I think I'm going to be part of the conversations as much as I can, though, to make sure that they are taking what I would say is like a more distinction-based approach. So allowing the Métis communities to lead the Métis part and allow First Nations to do that part. Because this idea that we can all just fit under one umbrella, that doesn't work anymore.
I thought, was there a question from Donna from the PUF, Susan, in the chat room?
Yeah, Grant answered that. That's about
sorry.
acknowledging.
Oh, that was about that.
Acknowledgement in the morning. Yeah.
Okay.
The PUF program still exists?
Yes, it does. Yeah,
Great.
sort of. Yeah,
My
it's
son
moved.
Andrews was a part of it for a year.
Yeah.
But I was told it was like being like axed, but I don't know.
No, the PUF program is still very much there. What they did was they reduced the funding of it significantly. So the impact for us was that we feel very strongly about offering supports in each individual's family's neighborhood, or where the family chooses to place their child for a preschool or a kindergarten class.
Yeah.
And financially, it took such a hit that we actually had to design two on-site classrooms for the first time in 23. We've been around 25 years, and for 23 years we operated like that. And it's been a big shift and change for us. I mean, there's benefits to it that we really can do a more focused program. We're not relying on being just advisory teachers to other teachers. But we really miss that they don't have access to their own community play schools that I think they're better served at. So
Yeah, and that's I think the one thing that Alberta's missing is Ontario has like an autism program that's provincial.
mhm,
Alberta doesn't
yeah.
have that. We have like a department. There's like an FASD department, but nothing
Yeah.
specific to autism either, right? So
Yeah.
those are conversations I'm trying to have too. So
mhm.
I've been hounding. Well, I don't know if he'll be minister anymore by today, but Luan, I've been trying to for like 6 months.
Right. Yeah.
And then-
Yeah.
No, so it'll be interesting. Like I know I try and stay away from politics, but I understand the power that comes with it, and all like you need it. You need to be able to navigate too. So
Yeah. The other big change with the PUF was that what they took away was any family support. So it's educational only. Whereas, PUF used to be, they went into your home and they worked with you and they shared the strategies, and they were strategies at home and in school were aligned. And that's gone. They don't want you to do that at all. So it's difficult.
that's where so for us, we tried doing like our services through just straight through AHS, like going to like a clinic and working with an SLP there. And that
Mhm.
wasn't obviously working. And so now we have in-home services, which I'm really grateful for.
Yeah.
But on top of that, like our providers, they come in and they train the parents, right, too.
Mhm.
And that didn't happen either. And so like for me, the parents are the experts of the child.
Yeah.
Like you can go in there and you can, create strategies and develop plans and things like that. But at the end of the day, if those parents aren't involved at every step of the way, there's going to be much less buy-in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I had a question, Grant. I'm Eva. I support some young adults, some of who joined us this morning from our Quest department. I was wondering if you had some ideas for resources to sort of access to support some of our individuals in exploring Indigenous culture and just kind of getting exposed and aligned with it if they haven't had that experience, because I know a few of them are quite interested in that and just looking for an appropriate place to start exploring that.
Yeah, so there's some really great even sites within Alberta. It depends on where you are. So there's like the UNESCO Heritage Site, Head Smashed in Buffalo, jumping. I was there just like last summer. Really great place just to spend like an afternoon, have lunch and things like that. You can get a guide. They have movies and informational stuff. So here in Edmonton, if you're in Edmonton, it's not open right now, but it'll open again in the spring. We have Fort Edmonton, which they just opened their Indigenous experience. Again, and a great opportunity. I think it's very interactive. You go in there, you can touch things, and I think you need to be mindful of that sensory part too, right? And then of course there's the museums and things. They usually have something that's going to learn. You're going to learn something about something, but a lot of these things, they're very historical. And what I think my thing is like, yeah, go to a powwow, but just be prepared. The powwows are very intense. They're loud, a lot of people, there's bells, a lot of, even visually, they're super bright if you go to like the grand entry. And so that's what I want to develop though. And so maybe I'll keep everybody in the loop here. It's about that sensory friendly powwow that you can show up to, just be yourself, like no judgment, no having to like mask or anything. I don't want anything like that, but also be able to, enjoy the dancing and then get taught at the same time. Like there's different powwow dances that have very unique histories behind them that a lot of people don't know, including myself. I just started powwow dancing actually this summer, and I got my outfit. I got my son his outfit too. So Anders, like I said, Marshall, I don't think I'll ever be able to do it. It's just too much. Anders loves crowds. He's like, he like feeds off of them. He doesn't get overwhelmed. He's just like in there doing his dance, and I was dancing beside him, and it's an amazing experience. And I've been asked this, like, can I go to a powwow? And yes, you can come to a powwow. So if you're in Calgary, the nearest one would be Sarcee or Sutina, which is just west of the city. I believe theirs is end of July. If you're in Edmonton, Enoch Cree Nation powwow is the first week, and that's again just west. And then, you know, Lethbridge area, there's Kainai. And there's usually something happening every weekend like that. And they're not ceremonial, they have ceremonial aspects, but they're more of just a celebration of people wanting to get together. So those would be mine. I'm not sure if, is it Diane, sorry? There could be an opportunity to, maybe there'd be an opportunity to partner with our community at Muscocheese, right?
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah,
And we could have like a pipe ceremony or feast ceremony.
yeah, that would be interesting.
Because those are the things that I think a lot of people want to experience. They just don't have that connection or that kind of and they're really, and like I said, these are really inclusive spaces. They do have certain protocols you need to follow and things like that, but like you should never be turned away from a ceremony. And if you do get turned away, that's not the ceremony for you.
Interesting. Okay.
Hi, Grant. I'm Renee.
And
I wanted to, when you made your comment about involving daycares in supporting parents to recognize some early differences in their children, that like put a light bulb in my head. I'm like, yeah, I'm thinking people usually think, oh, go to your pediatrician, but your pediatrician sees your kid maybe once a year, but your daycare could see them 5 days a week from the time they're 12 months old. Have you branched into that area of finding resources or education pieces for those educators at all, and even more specifically within daycares in Indigenous communities?
yeah, so that's one of our goals anyways. And I don't know, like I personally, like I said, I'm one person and I wish I could take something like that on right away. But that's exactly what Lonnie Zwagenbaum does. Like he goes and he talks about, you know, what does autism look like? Here are the different things that can be happening with this child. How do we, and then I know the Glenrose can provide that type of training for like daycares or schools. They'll come in and train, not train, but like teach the teachers about what to look for and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Are there other questions? Okay, I'm just very conscious of Grant's time. He's been very generous this morning, and I know he's got other things to get to. So I really want to thank you for coming out today and sharing your learnings with us, and sharing your personal stories, and reminding us that we all have personal stories, and we should be all learning from our ancestors and exploring our past. That was an aha moment for me. So thank you for that. I would love to stay in touch, and I know a number of the communities and groups that you're working with, and so I really do see that we would have a role or help you with some support that you may need in that, and look forward to working with you in the future, Grant. So you know how to reach out to Jackie, and I'm sure she'll reach out to you as well. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, one final thought is just here's a little lesson. So in Cree or Nehiyaw, and how we say thank you is hi hi.
Hi, hi.
Hi, but you're not actually thanking that person. You're thanking the computer for bringing that person into your life at that moment. So
Okay. Oh, interesting.
So hi hi. Thank you all for listening today. I feel good now that you all know just a little bit more about our experiences.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, everybody, let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and finish our staff meeting. All right.